There are a lot of teen boy protagonists across a lot of media and cultures. It's a pretty universal and very basic archetype, but the amount I can think of off the top of my head is frankly staggering. Specifically, I'm talking about male protagonists who start their stories with something to learn as normal boys that any reader can project onto, usually as part of a coming of age tale. For instance, there's Harry Potter, Shinji Ikari, Steven Universe, Percy Jackson, Ash Ketchum, Gon, Naruto, Peter Parker, Scott Pilgrim, Simone, Marty McFly, Edward Elric. You get the idea. Teen boy protagonists are nothing new, and after a while, they begin to blend together into an archetype, with many of them failing to stand out among their peers. This is no surprise, as to make a protagonist more relatable, an author might give them fewer noticeable traits to make them more easy to project onto. But this creates an issue, one that I call Protagonist Syndrome, the phenomenon that occurs when the main character is often one of the least interesting members of the cast. For instance, in the first Harry Potter novel, Harry doesn't actually speak for much of the beginning. The story focuses on the world swirling around him. Simone from Gurren Lagann is just a tag-along kid for much of the beginning of his adventure, and everyone knows and hates Shinji Ikari. At the end of the day, most people don't come away saying, the main character is my favorite. I understand why this phenomenon exists, and certainly in the end, many of these protagonists end up with defining characteristics, but there are just as many protagonists who don't fall into this trap. Take Edward Elric, for instance. He doesn't have protagonist syndrome as bad as his peers because he has defining traits such as metal limbs, an inferiority complex, and skills with alchemy. Or Steven Universe and Gon both feature a particularly sunny disposition that sets them apart. But we can do better than this. The one piece of media that is best at avoiding protagonist syndrome in my experience is Avatar: The Last Airbender's Aang. I'm going to break down various pitfalls that having a boring protagonist can cause, and how Avatar deftly avoids each and every one of them. Pitfall number 1. Being boring. Now, being boring, I know, sounds somewhat subjective, but specifically what I mean is having no discernible traits. Let's take, for example, Harry Potter. Harry is the main character, sure, but outside of being hot-headed, he isn't particularly well defined. A good test for this you can run in your head, I call the slap test. Imagine that someone slaps your character right in the face. How well and how quickly can you imagine your character would react to this? How quickly and how vividly can you imagine what they might say or might do, or in the case of animated characters, what they might look like? With Harry, despite having read the books quite a few times, I have trouble imagining him doing anything specific. Maybe he says, ow. Maybe he goes, hey. In the case of Aang, there are any number of answers. He might become upset that someone hurt him. He might preach about pacifism since he was raised by monks. He might not be quick to anger since he is generally very even-tempered. This is of course by no means scientific, but you can see how Aang has a more rich palette of reactions to draw from to characterize him. Let's examine something less subjective then. Pitfall 2. Plot motion. In many protagonists' cases, a plot unfurls without their input. This can work in some cases, but a protagonist should either have stakes in the plot or drive it in some way. Otherwise, why are they the protagonist? For instance, in Gurren Lagann, Simone hardly feels like the protagonist for the first half of the series, since he so seldom does anything to be involved in the story. Granted, this is thematically appropriate, but his brother Kamina dominates the screen until the later parts of the series. Simone often simply gets dragged along or blunders into the plot, which gives us a sense that Kamina is the true protagonist of the piece. Avatar does quite the opposite. Aang makes choices constantly, and he's at the center of his story's world. Too often in stories about chosen ones, authors shy away from this aspect, but Aang wears it well. He moves the plot with his own actions, and his choices ripple throughout the greater world he inhabits. This speaks not only to Aang's design, but the design of Avatar's world as well. Lore and character can often feel disparate, but of course, for the Avatar, this is not the case. Pitfall 3. Uniqueness. Often, an author will write a character who is intentionally blank, perhaps to invoke a sense of realism, as with Shinji Ikari of Evangelion, but more often, this makes a protagonist seem unremarkable. Shinji is a, quote, normal kid, which plays into Evangelion's theme as a deconstruction of the mecha genre, but for him as a character, it's a disservice. He reacts like a normal person would to being put in a robot, but we don't want to watch the media to watch normal people. Another example is Marty McFly for different reasons. Instead of being blank to evoke realism, he is blank in order to cast a wide net, to draw a large number of people in order to relate to him. In an attempt to make a relatable teen, Marty is given very few discerning traits. He has a couple of catchphrases and evokes the general spirit of a teenager, but he could be replaced with anyone and the story would play out much the same. This interchangeability is less true about Aang. He is given not only traits, but skills. He is an adept airbender when the show begins, and he's shown to have been raised with a great deal of virtue due to being fathered by monks. He has a rich history, but he still manages to be a very good audience surrogate by showing the same struggles and self-esteem issues a normal boy his age would have. Universal experiences need not be boiled down so far as to make the characters only traits. I mentioned before that Edward Elric had a great deal of characterization, even though he doesn't lose any of the appeal that a protagonist should have. Pitfall 4. Focus. Very few stories have one character. For the ones who don't, how well a protagonist shares the limelight can show how well they work within their own story. Oftentimes, the pacing in Pokemon can feel somewhat contrived. Ash Ketchum, despite being an allegedly normal boy from a small town, seems to have all manner of fanciful event happen around him. The Pokemon movies are an especially egregious example of this, but even between seasons, his partners are nigh interchangeable. He changes which Pokemon he uses and who accompanies him on his journeys. This has improved over the years, of course, but he seems like the center of a universe and overshadows his friends in terms of development. In a way, this oversaturation can lead to fatigue, as the suspension of disbelief is gradually stripped away, and too much focus on one character can make their more grating characteristics come to light more often. Steven Universe has this issue in the beginning, as Steven is often shoehorned into otherwise interesting missions with his plethora of moms, and the focus on him can hold these plots back. Aang, as usual, avoids this issue. He often shares the screen with his team, Katara, Sokka, and later Toph and Zuko, but the time is spent too focusing on other parts of the plot and other parts of the world. This isn't only Aang's story, even if he is in the middle of it. This makes the world around him feel richer and less like he's carrying the world around on a leash behind him. At the end of the day, Aang is a standout example of protagonism, but that's not to say anyone I've mentioned so far is bad in any way. This is less a criticism of the shows I've invoked, and more a celebration of Avatar and a critique of protagonists the world over. So often the protagonists of stories lean into a generic role, a cookie-cutter existence created to cast a wide net and appeal to as many fans as possible. Wide appeal is still possible with unique character designs, particularly in the way of protagonists, and I'd like to both critique this phenomenon as well as bring it to light. If you're a writer, take heart, and if you're simply a media consumer, then perhaps you'll have a deeper understanding of this issue going forward. Whatever the case, I hope you enjoyed this protagonist showcase, and I hope we can end Protagonist Syndrome once and for all. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment or send it to a friend. All these actions immensely help my videos appear in the algorithm and spread to others. Visit my Twitter at FunkMcLovin, and everyone say hi to my 3 cats, who I love. Shout out to my good friend Clayton Zimmerman. I haven't seen him since high school, and I hope he's doing great. Everyone have a wonderful day.